There's a kind of religion that does not mainly ask, how do I get to heaven when I die? What it actually asks is, when does heaven come down here? They don't treat this as a metaphor. It is a real event. It's a crisis, a judgment, and it's followed by a new age. And that's the atmosphere we need to understand before Joanna Southcott makes any sense at all, because she's not even necessarily normal inside that idea, but we can read her and understand her a bit better inside it. This is episode 2 of the Joanna Southcott series, and today it is about millenarianism, where we zoom right out and have a look at what kind of environment she lived and moved in. So, millenarianism, it's the 1,000 years from Revelation 20, and it's that expectation of a radical change, often catastrophic, and it's full of judgment, and then the world is put right. And today I want to do 2 things. Firstly, I want to define millenarianism as carefully as time allows, and then I want to show you why late Georgian England was a place where a woman in her 60s could say, Shiloh is coming, and thousands of people would not instantly switch off and think she was mad. Now, I'm not asking you to agree with Joanna Southcott. I'm not even asking you really to feel any sympathy for her. But what I want us to understand is the structure that she's in, because once we see that structure, we can start treating her like a person, and we can start treating people like real people. Now, if you've ever read Revelation chapter 20, then you know the issue already. There's a reign, a binding of Satan, a resurrection, 1,000 years, one final rebellion, and then judgment. And Christians have argued about that chapter of the Bible for a very long time. Some Christians treat this as a literal future sequence. Firstly, Christ returns, then the millennium happens, and then there is the end. And that's what people often refer to and what they mean by pre-millennial. Other Christians can read this as the millennium as more symbolic, and the 1,000 years can stand for the church age, or for the reign of Christ in heaven, or the way God rules now through the gospel, and that would be the amillennial position. And then there are Christians who expect the gospel to spread throughout history in such a way that, in some sense, the long age of gospel triumph comes before Christ's return, and that would be post-millennial. And then beyond those, I think you also get Christians who read a great deal of apocalyptic language as already fulfilled in the ancient world, especially around the fall of Jerusalem in the 1st century. And that's where the sort of preterist reading would come from. Now, look, I know I'm simplifying, but the point I'm trying to make is that Joanna enters a Christian argument that already exists. She's not inventing a new problem. What she's doing is she's radicalizing one way of living inside millenarianism. And Francis McConnell, who wrote in 1919, summarizes premillennial expectation as that scriptural 1,000 years of peace following the return of Christ in his physical manifestation. And then he notes that that idea has been with the church from the very beginning. So this is not a modern American thing, or even a 18th century, late 18th century British thing. It's much older than that. But what I think we can identify is that this premillennial idea returns in waves. It seems to come in waves at the end of each century. So as the century is drawing to a close, we see a rise quite often in premillennialism. So Once you go the more symbolic route, as it were, the temperature can then sort of change because you still believe that Christ will return, but you stop acting like you can circle a day on the calendar. So already before Joanna, we have this different ways, this sort of interpretive fork in the road. And what happens in Britain in the 1790s, it is full of people who are publicly taking this millenarianism and premillennial route. In the academic literature, millenarianism is often used as a sort of umbrella term. It's the belief that a fundamental transformation is coming, that the present order that we're living in now is corrupt or even oppressive, and that a dramatic, sudden change will take place in a new age. And sometimes that change is imagined as peaceful, and sometimes it's imagined as violent and cataclysmic and destructive, but it's always this world that's going to change. And it's not only the soul goes up, but it is God comes down. Now, Paul Vanderwood, who's writing about millenarian movements in another context, puts this very plainly. He says, millenarians want their utopia now and in this world. And that impatience is a common thread, even when the details seem to differ absolutely wildly, because what it means is that millenarianism is not necessarily a sign of stupidity, but it's a sign that you're living in some moral pain, and people look at the world and say, this cannot be its final form. And sometimes that moral pain can be very personal, or it can be broader and political or economic. But what usually happens is all three of those, the personal, the political, and the economic, are all tangled together. When we're looking at this subject, we'll sometimes see two words thrown around as if they mean exactly the same thing. You've got millennialism and millenarianism. And in everyday speech, I think people sometimes mix them up. Scholars and academics, they do try and keep a distinction, not always successfully. So millennialism is often used for a much more specific Christian set of expectations tied to Revelation 20 and the millennium. Whereas millenarianism can be used more broadly across different cultures, and sometimes with an emphasis on this sudden rupture. And it's the idea that the new age arrives by some crisis and collapse and judgment. And there are academics like Stephen Jay Gould, who oddly enough even gets pulled into this debate just to argue sort of about the spelling and the roots. And he doesn't do this to win a vocab game. But the point is to notice that there are different atmospheres, even inside end times expectation, because some people imagine the transition as almost seamless and like this gradual triumph, and others probably imagine it as the transition as this snap or this hard break where the old order is suddenly smashed. And here's why I'm mentioning it in this series, because Joanna's movement has both ideas at once inside it. Because on the one hand, they have a very churchy presentation of prayer book worship and sermons and hymns and this sort of moral exhortation. And that feels closer to the peaceful millennial hope, the kingdom arriving as the world is more and more persuaded. And on the other hand, you have this sharp conflict story where in Southcottian thinking, Satan's reign is cut short, judgment is coming, the proud are brought down, and a decisive divine intervention happens. And that feels millenarian in the more sort of cataclysmic sense. So when you read her books, or even just the summaries, you should read what she had in her mind. She's not predicting dates. She is narrating a kind of cosmic lawsuit. It's God versus Satan, the woman versus the serpent, and history, the whole of history is her courtroom. And that also explains why more mainstream churches get nervous about what she is saying. And let's say that, the Roman Catholic Catechism, for example, explicitly warns against trying to realize messianic hope within history and rejects political forms of millenarianism, all political forms. And Protestants as well have their own versions of that same caution, because even if they do not phrase it in the same way, there are many who are still cautious about this millenarian view. But once you start treating your timetable as certain, which actually Joanna Southcott begins to, it becomes very easy to justify almost anything. If you're living through stable years, it's easy to spiritualize everything. But if you're living through unstable years, then we can start reading the news like it's an omen. Joanna's main active years begin in the 1790s. And what are the 1790s? They're the French Revolution and war. There's plenty of food anxiety, and there's rumors and political suspicion and a huge amount of religious controversy. And on top of that, you have a Protestant culture that has never fully stopped reading the book of Revelation. And I think here's one of the details that people often miss, that millenarianism in England had a history. And that history does not start with Joanna Southcott. There are older English patterns stretching back through radical Protestantism and further back into medieval apocalypticism. A millenarian expectation survived on the fringes during the medieval period that then re-emerged in the early, or the 1730s, when the idea of churchism, so your devotion is to the church, gave way to biblicism, that evangelical enlightenment moment where the Bible becomes available and central to more and more people, more central than the church. And so at that point, the Bible becomes the court of appeal. And then what do? You go back to Daniel, and you go back to Revelation, and you start building schemes again. And this is one strand. Then another strand is that sort of culture of calculation, the idea that prophetic time can be decoded. And you can feel that in some of the material that circulates around Joanna's world, there are pamphlets and essays trying to align dates and calendars and the prophetic weeks in Daniel and the Hebrew years, and the looming sense that history has a fixed timetable. And enter Emanuel Swedenborg and his followers. They're a really good example of that mood. And by the later 18th century, people around that world could speak as if sacred history had already entered a decisive new phase. The year is 1757, according to Swedenborg, where that marked the advent of the millennium. And then in 1785, one follower states that the New Jerusalem of Revelation had come down upon earth, and that people should now expect an internal millennium. Now, I'm not saying Joanna is simply a Swedenborgian. She is not. I'm saying that this is the kind of atmosphere she belongs to. And if you want to see that in poetic form, then head to William Blake's Songs of Innocence and then Songs of Experience, where there is this great millenarian and millennial hope and in innocence, and then songs of experience, it becomes much more realistic and devastated, and all that tied around this great hope and the French Revolution, which does, in the end, bring more pain and more death and less hope than they had imagined. Now, none of this means that chronology is right. It means really just that the habit of creating a chronology and a sequence exists. And once the habit does exist, then people are primed for to figure out when these things are going to happen and who claims revelation. And it's not just a calculation. And these is where figures like Blake and Swedenborg really help, even though Joanna and they are simply not the same thing. However, they show us the scale of that religious world that she belonged to. And Blake moves in a London where prophetic and millenarian language is still alive, and where revelation is not a dead text, but a way of narrating the age that they're in, and where revolutionary expectation can be read through this biblical imagery. And Swedenborg, in a different register, I suppose, shows that claims about last judgment, the new Jerusalem, and that decisive turning in sacred history are not bizarre one-off ideas dropped out of nowhere, that they are already part of the wider late Georgian imagination. Joanna does not simply say the end is near. She says the Bible already told you how it would happen. And she focuses on a cluster of passages on Genesis 3, the promise to the woman, the serpent, and the seed, and Genesis 49, where she brings in Shiloh, and then Revelation 12, the woman, the man-child, and the dragon. And then the wider scenery of the whole of the book of Revelation with the sealing and judgment and kingdom. If you read the summaries of her published books, you see this repeated pattern. She keeps returning to the fall and to the claim that the woman must be vindicated because Adam blamed her, but the woman blamed the serpent. And she keeps returning to this imagery of the book of Revelation, and she keeps returning to the idea that the kingdom of Christ is at hand. So the millenarian element is not just Jesus is coming back. It is a claim that the process of final redemption has to run through a particular woman role in Scripture. And that's why critics called her the woman of Revelation with a negative tone. And at the same time, her followers took it as a title. Biblical apocalypticism can have a triangular relationship between text, interpreter, and context. Text gives us the symbols, and the interpreter gives us a reading, and then the context that we're living in gives us that urgency, and the three lock together. So, for example, with Joanna, the text is Revelation, Genesis, Daniel, and that prophetic habit of types and shadows. And the interpreter is a working woman with a very stubborn sense that God still speaks and that the Spirit dictates. And then the context is war, social anxiety, and a religious culture that already expects to see the signs of the times. And this is how a movement forms, because a lot of modern people assume that the followers were basically buying magic. But when you read the material sympathetically, you can see they thought they were buying a theological and spiritual and worldly coherence. It was a way of dealing with real life and a way of not going insane in an age that felt like it was under judgment. Millenarianism often carries a moral inversion. And what I mean by that is the proud fall and the low are lifted, the powerful are exposed, and then the meek inherit. And that really is biblical language, but it's also social language. And this is why millenarian movements can look political, even when they insist they are not. Because if you say God will soon overturn the present order, then you are implying that the present order deserves overturning. And that's exactly why these movements draw such intense hostility. They're not only predicting, they're also accusing. And once biblicism displaces that settled church system, then the individual apocalyptic imagination can be reactivated. And then we get the clashes, because apocalyptic people do not easily fit under institutional management. I think that's the same today as back in the 1790s and early 1800s. But here is something that surprised me the first time I looked at it. Joanna's sealing practice is not only about the eschaton or the end. It's not only about the end. It's also about belonging. People sign and then they receive a seal. It is this visible act of commitment, and it functions like a boundary marker. It is a sacrament that is not baptism or the Eucharist, but it is still a marker that says, I am in this story. And because she's operating in the Church of England world, she does something interesting, because the movement, at least in a way it presents itself, keeps that prayer book liturgy. It keeps ordinary dress, and it tries to look less like a new sect and more like a visitation within Christianity. And a later Southcottian summary of belief is very revealing, because it reads largely like a standard Christian confession on the surface. The idea of one God, Christ, the Spirit, and redemption. But it is orientated towards this expectation of Christ's kingdom on earth, the binding of Satan, and that 1,000-year reign. So the movement does not present itself. Southcottianism is not trying to present itself as a new religion. It's trying to present itself as Christianity that has been intensified by prophecy. And that explains why some clergy were attracted to it, even briefly, and why others were absolutely furious. We need to get honest about what makes millenarian movements implode. It is not usually the general hope that God will judge evil. I think Christians in general can live with that. What people have problems with, I think, is the specificity, the date, the named event, that public claim. And in Joanna's world, we see both. There is a slow, broad teaching about the kingdom. And on top of that, there is a sharp, exposed claim about Shiloh from Genesis 49. And once you put a date on it, like Joanna does, and we'll do an episode on this, then you're no longer just preaching. You are staking everything on that prophetic claim. And what happens is the hostile press around Joanna during the last years of her life shows the social effect of that, and even accounts sympathetic to her acknowledge that there's a frenzy and a mockery and a load of crowds around her. And after her death, there's the dissection and the fact that no child was found, and that becomes a weapon. And it's a way of saying, see, Joanna Southcott was all a delusion. But from a believer's perspective, that moment is not only a failure, it becomes a test. And prophecy and prophetic movements are sometimes famous for turning this failed expectation into a requirement of deeper loyalty. Now, that's not always, but often, and that's worth bearing in mind if you're anything to do with any prophetic movement today. When they fail, they demand deeper, or can demand deeper loyalty. And so you question less. And my point would be this: if you're in a movement that moves in the prophetic, then question it. I wouldn't go as far as to say, as I heard people do say, to be skeptical, but I would receive information with joy, and I would check it, and I would test it, and I would become skeptical when people speak in the name of God and those things do not happen. So let's give an answer about maybe why people believed. And I don't want to give an answer that's really flattering, but something that is probably a bit closer to what's true. I think people believe Joanna Southcott, firstly, because the Bible made her ideas imaginable. And then that political moment that everyone was living in made the idea really urgent. And then her personal story of where she came from and how God supposedly spoke to her and the Spirit led her made the idea credible to some. She was a working woman. She wasn't a bishop or a gentleman or even a impressive pamphlet theorist, but she is someone who claimed that she was compelled. And to many, those three things together sounded like a biblical pattern, because God chose the low, and he's choosing the unlikely and choosing to do what the respectable would not do. And even in that, I'm not claiming this is what happened. I'm saying that perhaps this is how it felt inside that moment. It gives people a story, and it gives them a way to interpret the crisis. So episode 2 really has been the large, broad frame, that millenarianism in the air that Joanna is breathing. And it's the world behind her words and what she says. And next episode, I want to go closer. I want to show us the particular triangle that's at work in her case: the text, the interpreter, and the context. And we'll do that through the social technology that holds all of that together, where it's the sealed writings and the trials and the witnesses and the box. So if you think, oh, you've not spoken about Joanna very much today, I'm trying to for us to grasp what kind of environment she lived in, so that when we start addressing her works and her ideas and how she's saying things, then we can understand more clearly what it is she's really getting at. Because whether you think she was holy or deluded or manipulative or just something strange, I think one thing is clear: this is not a random set of beliefs, because it's organized and it was argued and they were published and it was then contested in public. And once we can see that, we can stop treating Joanna Southcott like a punchline or a name to drop in, and we can start treating her like a historical problem, which I think is really what she is. And just to say, if you're a Christian listener, you do not have to adopt Joanna to learn anything from her. We can treat her as a warning about certainty, or we can treat her as a window into how ordinary believers read the Bible when they're under a certain kind of pressure. But either way, I think it's worth looking. So if you want to follow along with the primary material, I will keep pointing to specific books which are all available online next time. But for now, let's just take this away, that millenarianism is not just a prediction, but it's a protest and a hope. And it is a demand that God does not leave the world as it is. God bless.